This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to scientist and researcher Jovana Maksic. She's going to be talking to us about the very tense situation in Serbia. Recently there was 2 mass shootings in the space of a few days. In turn, there have been huge anti-violence protests which have also kind of coalesced into anti-government protests. As well as that, there is the situation in Serbian parts of Kosovo. Things are very, very tense. Jovana is going to explain to us what's happening and how Serbia got to this stage. Support us at patreon.com/popularfront. Recently, there's been a lot of commotion, to say the least, in Serbia. Not talking about Kosovo, Serbian parts of Kosovo right now. We'll get into that later. But in Serbia proper, there's been some situations and there's been large protests, threats of violence. The government has been doing some strange thing, bussing people in. There's been several mass shootings. It sounds like a big kind of powder keg, and everything has culminated recently, and things are looking quite unsettled. Maybe you can just kind of at first just take us back to where this kind of recent commotion started and what's actually happening.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to talk about the situation and kind of hopefully give some insights that will clarify it for people listening in. But essentially, the most recent wave of protests, so to say, were triggered by an event which happened on May 13th, so last month. And here, a 13-year-old boy murdered 9 of his fellow school students and a bodyguard in Belgrade. He used his father's technically legally owned handgun, and because he was younger than 14, he wasn't charged for the crime. And then one day after, a 21-year-old person in Mladenovac, which is a village south of Belgrade, again went on a shooting spree where he first shot 11 friends who were just having a barbecue, and then continued driving down to other nearby villages, shooting at random people. So in total, another 8 people lost their lives and multiple people were injured. But these mass violence events that happened were just the tip of the iceberg of decades of murders and assaults being absolutely hushed up, with essentially nobody taking real accountability. So spanning from journalists being killed and threatened to extremely high yearly femicide rates, factory worker deaths, the current government and overall system in Serbia clearly does not value human life. And the people here have known this for a very long time, but I think the school massacre was really decisive in waking up every last individual to see this. And the kind of symbolic importance of this event was not only about the bullets being shot into our children, it was also a symbol that the most precious part of our society, particularly the children and the youth, are no longer safe and protected from this amount of violence and hatred. And not only that, but these younger generations are growing up in a completely detrimental moral system where violence is normalized and encouraged, corruption is the standard, and hopes are extremely low. So people kind of realize that they can no longer escape into this final resort of happiness, the love that they have for their family, and that they have nothing more to lose. So this was a very powerful moment. And I think the people are kind of losing their fear slowly.
After these two mass shootings, there were huge protests, right? And I saw some reporting on it, but I think people were a little bit confused. These were essentially protests calling for like an end to this kind of culture of violence. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So the protest that started after this recent shooting event, or event plural, They essentially were against the current authoritarian regime and system, which clearly devalues human lives and human rights. So the people came out in the streets to protest against violence, as you said, like they're literally called Serbia against violence, because historically violence has been the one driving force which has divided and oppressed people, not only in Serbia, but also all over the Balkans. So people were extremely sick of constantly living in a system which uses media to reinforce something that we call a culture of violence, which I'll get into detail later. So this weekend, upcoming weekend, is going to be the fifth in a row of the protests, which are largely helped organized by the different oppositionary parties, but primarily the protests are organized by the people for the people. So the idea is that these protests cannot erupt into violent protests, because this is exactly what Vucic and the regime wants.
So, sorry, just for anyone that doesn't know, Vucic being the current president, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is kind of like the overarching element that everything is leading to, that this person who has been in power essentially since the time of Slobodan Milosevic is still using the exact same techniques to control everybody. So that's what people are trying to protest. People also have very concrete demands for the current demos. For example, they are requesting the resignation of the current state officials. They're requesting a boycott and full removal of state-sponsored media outlets, and also the members of the regulatory agency for electronic media to resign, essentially boycotting state-funded tabloids, which very heavily advocate for hate speech and violence and report on everything in such vile and disgusting ways. So these were kind of one of the main requests. Of course, the requests continue, but the most important thing is that people want, first of all, the media, which is seen as kind of like the extended arm of the regime, used to manipulate and reinforce and instill this violent behavior, to be banned, essentially. And then if it continues, which I think it will, the wave is leading towards the removal of Aleksandar Vucic as president.
And this isn't the first time there have been protests against him. Okay, maybe these aren't directly just anti-him, it's anti-culture of violence or whatever, but clearly he is a big part of this, and the people seem to believe that he is at the center of this kind of culture of violence that's being pushed at the moment. There were serious clashes, I think, over a year ago now, maybe 2 years ago now. Violent clashes in the streets. We spoke about it then. Would you say that like this is kind of a similar group of people, or is it something completely different?
I would say that the protest back then definitely included a big portion of the people who are also going now, including me. But I think what was different from the protest then is that they were extremely, extremely violent, and they erupted into these uncontrollable levels of violence, where we have witnessed levels of police brutality that have not been seen since the time of Milosevic. And after about 7 days of protesting, people just got truly scared, because everybody who was there, who literally did not do anything, people from sitting on a bench nearby, would get beaten. We were being thrown tear gas, and not just tear gas, but expired tear gas. There were military units, police on horses and cars chasing down people. It was just insane levels of violence. And then previously, before the COVID protests, there were multiple waves of protests ever since Vucic became president. So, for example, in 2018 and 19, there were also protests against Vucic's presidency, which was believed to be false, essentially, because the way he kind of comes to this power is first by influencing the masses of people who have no other access to media other than the one that's state sponsored, where Vucic is able to kind of use this to manipulate everybody. And then on top of that, a large amount of people are being blackmailed into voting for Vucic and his SNS, or the Serbian Progressive Party. And a particularly sinister thing that I need to mention about the current protest, which relates to this way of Vucic controlling and blackmailing people. He actually organized a contra meeting. So this was supposed to be kind of like a protest where he would show that he has a high number of people that support him, because he was starting to get afraid and agitated with this number of people, which is now growing into over 100,000 in the streets, not just Belgrade, but other cities as well. So what he did is he invited thousands and tens of thousands of Serbs from all over the region with the promise of getting a small amount of money, like literally less than 20 euros, uh, a sandwich, a warm meal, which for a lot of people is very much necessary because they live in high levels of poverty. But also people who would not come, they were threatened to lose their jobs. So a lot of people were blackmailed, literally blackmailed into coming to this gathering organized by Vucic. Many people lost their jobs. And not only that, places that depend on state funding from like official centers that regulate, like IT centers in some cities, stopped functioning. So like hundreds of thousands of computers were not being able to run anymore because the directors of the center would not be blackmailed and come to show up for Vucic's fake protest. So it's just extremely, extremely sinister that this person decided to go against his own people who are literally in the most peaceful way expressing their mourning and anger and frustration with this system after the death of children. And he decided to organize his own protest for this. And the scenes were just absolutely gruesome. Like heavy rain poured down. There were all of these buses that were rented literally from everywhere, from like kindergartens, schools. And people would just come in hordes and gather there with no sense of direction, no sense of unity. You would just see all of these like hordes of hooligans who would wave around flags of the Serbian Progressive Party and Vucic. And the scenes just looked like some fucking dystopian like movie for real. And it's unbelievable that these are scenes from the same city which one day after is hosting real human beings with real unity, showing real support and like frustration against the system.
So he's basically tried to astroturf kind of pro-Vucic protests. When are the next elections?
I'm actually not sure anymore because I got like way too caught up in all of this situation. But regardless, Vucic is having a firm hold on the election every time they roll around. And every time the election comes by, some kind of major events and manipulations happen, clearly orchestrated by Vucic. Similarly, there's also no coincidence that the stuff happening in Kosovo is happening right now as all of these unrests are happening in Belgrade.
2026.
Well,
yeah, it's a while away.
Yeah, no, nothing is going to be changed in elections. That's the problem. And this is what basically the prime minister of Vucic, Ana Brnabić, recently said in parliament that the government in Serbia is not going to change in election. Like nobody is going to change the government in elections, which is exactly how governments can change. So like, why would you say this in the parliament, first of all? Second of all, she went ahead to insult the protesters and the people, which of course they blame either on their political opponents and oppositions, but they also say that the protesters peacefully coming with their entire families are drug addicts, that they're drunks, that they're advocating for violence. And I'm literally quoting her words right now from a parliament. She said, "These people are disgusting shitheads." These are the words of a prime minister of a country referring to their own people. It's just absolutely sinister. And this is exactly the thing that's fueling the anger in these protests, making them grow larger.
So when these people come out on the street, these anti-violence protests, what specifically is it that they're asking for? I mean, I get it, the sentiment, but that alone is kind of vague. Like, what is it specifically they want?
Right. So I think I kind of started mentioning some of the direct requests, but some of the main requests here focus on the media themselves. So they're requesting that the state-sponsored media outlets, including this Pink Television and Happy Television, which are the main two outlets that have been playing these reality shows in which you can see literally incredible levels of violence, from men beating, choking, degrading women, and this is, mind you, state-funded television that your children can watch, to absolutely like ridiculous hate speech. So people want these state media to stop airing these programs. They also want the current members of the Regulatory Agency for Electronic Media to resign. They also want the tabloids, which are funded by the state and preach Vucic propaganda, to stop working. They want the Minister of the Police to resign. They also want the resignation of Aleksandar Vulin, who is the director of the Security Information Agency, to resign. And they also want the Minister of Education to resign. And these are just one of the requests. And it seems like Vucic started, or at least like created, a kind of illusion that some of these requests are beginning to be accommodated. Like he said that the next season of these reality shows that people, have to watch is going to stop. But we have no guarantee that this is for real. He also announced that he's stepping down as the director of the Serbian Progressive Party. But he appointed somebody who is essentially like his minion. So nothing is truly changing. People are not getting the requests accommodated. And the biggest request and the biggest sentiment of all is, of course, Vucic to step down from the place of president.
Wait, so in Serbia, there are like reality TV shows just on normal TV where men are beating women?
Yeah. Yeah.
What? In what context is that happening?
Well, these shows are kind of like the equivalent of the Big Brother, except way trashier and way more violent. So, now this is insane, and it's really important to keep in mind that Vucic started his career as the Minister of Information under Milosevic. So this person who's right now president is an expert in manipulating information, creating illusions, using media as an extended arm to instill certain values and behaviors in the population. So these reality shows they seem to happen all the time. Like there's no pause. The people go inside and you can see them clearly mentally degrading because they're locked in these houses for months, and you literally witness men beating up women, women beating themselves up, saying the most like derogatory, disgusting stuff. And of course, you can say this about any reality show, but you have to keep in mind that this is Serbia and this is post-war Serbia. So everything, all the worst, all the most demonic behaviors come out there, and there's no filter. And similarly, Vucic very often likes to use this as a tool. Like he would come on national television and show the most gruesome details of certain murders and crimes to the population. Like one example of this is when it comes to the case of Veljko Belivuk. I don't know if you heard about this. This was a famous criminal clan leader. One intense demonstration of how Vucic uses these stark elements of violence to manipulate people and kind of shock people and then come in as the savior role was when he reported on Veljko Belivuk, the criminal clan leader, being arrested, which of course ended up being staged because Vucic apparently has connections to this leader. So he came on TV, national TV, and he brought photographs of a severed head, a headless body, a torso, which showed victims of Belivuk and his gang. So the president literally uses these extreme elements to kind of shock the people, and then comes in as the role of the savior, whatever, but absolutely undermines the psychological effects that using media in such a way have. And this is just implemented on every level in the media landscape of Serbia. The tabloids report about people in such a dehumanizing way. And all of this stuff is essentially orchestrated by the narrative that Vucic creates.
Yeah, that is kind of nuts. I mean, don't get me wrong, reality TV, for example, in my country, you know, you got like Love Island, just awful people, you know, selfish, just orchestrated narcissism. Like, it's disgusting. But people are certainly not beating women up on there. You know what I mean? It's not that level. Like, that is actually crazy that just goes out there like that. So obviously people are very angry about this kind of, you know, I think you've really very painted a very good picture, a grim picture, but painted a good picture of the kind of cultural violence there. And then there's lots of people out in the streets protesting. Now, I've seen the videos, you were showing me them, there's thousands of people. But there's obviously people that do like Vucic and that don't care about this culture of violence. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an appetite for it. What's their kind of, what are their sides saying? What are they doing?
Well, this is very difficult to assess because many people in this country that do support Vucic ultimately profit off of this system in some way. So either they are ideologically, culturally, and morally aligned with some of the values that are preached by Vucic and his party, or they're kind of allowed to slide and live, you know, sort of like a wealthy life and ignore these problems if they can. And this is really problematic because these people in the past have kind of allowed all of this stuff to happen. It seems like there's almost a parallel Serbia. And that's something that has been very much a conversation right now, that the people coming out in the streets to demo definitely see that there's also a layer of this people living in Serbia that think everything is fine, that, you know, as long as you make your money, you do your thing, things are great. Like, we don't want to go to the West. The West has all of these demoralizing behaviors, and Serbia is just an amazing place to live. But of course, it's a great place to live if you have a shit ton of money and you're blackmailed into not saying anything. So I think that's definitely one branch that is also controlled by Vucic and the regime. And I would say that a lot of this culture is kind of affiliated or in some way associated with the Turbofolk scene.
Explain that for our listeners. Do you know what I was going to say? If there's any media organization whose followers know what Turbofolk is, it will be Popular Front. But just for those that don't, maybe just explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's impossible not to mention Turbofolk because it always finds its way in any massive political movement in one way or another. It's also just in the subconscious, I think, of this entire population, especially my generation that, you know, kind of like accommodates it in a hyper ironic way. So essentially, Turbofolk is an art form or an aesthetic that began developing in its infancy during Yugoslavia, but truly gained popularity when the war and the breakup started. And this music advocates for nationalism on steroids, hot women, boob jobs, guns, low morale, lots of drama, essentially.
Arkan
And
type shit.
Arkan, yeah, absolutely. Like, so for those who maybe don't know, but I'm sure that, you know, most listeners definitely encountered Arkan so far. He was an infamous warlord and head of the Serbian paramilitary force during the Yugoslav wars. But he was married to the biggest Turbofolk star in the country, Ceca, who also in the past has been accused of smuggling guns and cocaine. And like, all of this stuff is just crazy, crazy intertwined. So essentially the main like form of media and aesthetic through Turbofolk is enforcing the exact same values that the regime and the system, which committed all of these crimes in the wars, is now still perpetrating. It's impossible to run away from Turbofolk, you know? Like, I love
It's like a glorification of this violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, Turbofolk is all about like violence is sexy. Like, everything is sexy. We want you to shoot somebody because that's the sexiest thing you can do. And I mean, of course, it's evolving in different directions. It can be really interesting. And I think it's kind of like a hybrid, almost post-human form. Like if you look at these singers, they had like insane levels of plastic surgery, but I'm talking like it's impossible to recognize how they looked before. And this is definitely a brand that's kind of maintained and sold. But also like Turbofolk singers, for example, there's this singer, Jelena Karleuša, who literally looks like a cyborg. She recently went on TV and she just heavily preached for Vucic. She expressed her support, how he is a strong figure who needs to, maintain unity in the region and protect us from the West and balance things out and protect Kosovo. And of course, like she got paid huge amounts of money to talk about all of this stuff on TV. She also kind of insulted the people coming out to protest right now. And it's just like absolutely insane.
I think that's actually is like kind of. Obviously, you've been showing me some Turbofolk stuff like quite regularly, and it is funny, but it's a really good point that like this is like kind of emblematic of like this kind of elitist, violent culture within Serbia, because that is the kind of hyper stereotype that people have of Serbs outside of Serbia. You know what I mean? Like in Western Europe, I mean, unfortunately, you say Serb in Western Europe, and it somehow is basically it's like people see that, particularly like the really hardcore, neoliberal, everything NATO does is perfect people. They will just go on and be like, yeah, Serbs are scum, they're fucking dirt, they're rodents. And these are so-called progressives will just openly talk like that about Serbs as if everyone in Serbia is a war criminal or something like that. And my point is like this kind of Turbofolk and that kind of culture of violence does very much feed into that stereotype. So I guess how much of that kind of stereotype is accurate within the country, within these like violent circles, and like how much is kind of not really about that?
Well, I mean, I would say that definitely a significant portion can be explained. If you come to Serbia and you go walk around in Belgrade, you're going to see a lot of this culture. Also, most clubs are going to play the music. So it's impossible. Even if you're a Serb who maybe, is not fully in this lifestyle, like a lot of people who were just the intellectuals from Yugoslavia, or like, the children of intellectuals from those times, like, my generation, for example, we cannot avoid Turbofolk. There is no avoiding. You just need to join it. You need to ride the wave. But I would say that really a huge part is accurate. But of course, that's not everything. Truly. There's also so many sub scenes and like subdivisions and underground things happening in Serbia that, of course, people don't know about because they just see the stereotype. And those are the people that actually have money to go outside and do their thing. And, there's a reason why the stereotype is being perpetrated. But of course, that's not all. There's a lot of subcultures happening and developing in Serbia.
And what was the kind of reaction to the mass shootings? That was, I mean, we didn't really go into detail of that, but they were very. That's not normal in Serbia, right? Like, obviously, we know there's a lot of violence, but 2 mass shootings that quickly, and they weren't really criminal related as far as I understand, right? They're just 2 kids that just went fucking bonkers.
Yeah, totally. I mean, to be fair, this is not the only incident that happened. Actually, on the same day that this school shooting occurred, in my high school in Belgrade, this girl apparently came to school and like stabbed a teacher and another student. And then a couple of days later, in my hometown, there were 2 different cases of young kids stabbing each other in the throat, or like a child taking an axe and like blowing it on its own mother, which is just absolutely insane. So it's not to say that this stuff is happening all the time, but it is happening quite often, just not to this scale. But I think the really shocking thing and what kind of caused this intense response was that when you witness something in a school with all of these young kids getting murdered, essentially, and then simultaneously the government is like making fun of it and not taking any responsibility. And Vucic essentially blamed this child to be manipulated by Western influence, or, the shooter is a neo-Nazi and they're mentally ill and all of this stuff. So he also talked about bringing the death sentence, which is absolutely insane. Like, you are not doing a proper self-reflection of why these things happen. They're symptomatic of the regime. And not only that, another thing that I really think pissed off a lot of Serbs, causing them to go in the streets, is that Vucic, Brnabic, so the prime minister, and Siniša Mali, who used to be the mayor of Belgrade but is now the minister of finance, they posted a selfie of the three of them. And in the selfie, they kind of like multiplied themselves to make it seem as if they were photoshopped. So this was them claiming that all of these people out in the streets were actually photoshopped. So they posted this on social media, and they literally joked about the people going out in the streets, like laughed in their faces. The people who are mourning the death of children and multiple people. It's just dark. It's sinister.
That is dark. And I mean, I don't want to be, I really hate when like people from Western Europe kind of do this snide, like, oh, look at all the lunatics in Eastern Europe. Like, don't get me wrong, Britain has a out of control stabbing knife violence problem. Some people that, you know, are never in proximity to it will tell you that it's exaggerated. It's not. It's really bad. But we don't have that. Like, and certainly our governments are not like mocking the people that are mourning the deaths of children who were shot in a mass shooting. That don't even happen in America. Like, that is wild. Like, how do you get to that stage, you know?
Yeah, that shit is just absolutely sinister. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg, you know? Like, people have been seeing this type of response and behavior. And I think the sentiment that everybody can share is that they feel insulted. Everybody usually, like, when you ask an old person, like, why are you out here protesting today? They say they're insulting my intelligence. That's literally what's happening. They are insulting and laughing in our faces. They are living off the backs of all of these people who live absolutely miserable lives with not enough money, being blackmailed and fed this media of like values that they don't even, you know, associate with. And now we see that this system is actually having real effects on the coming generations who think that this is the norm. So I think this is really the key to why people are going out in the streets in such numbers. And of course, you know, the government is going full on in denying this. They employed like thousands of bots and internet trolls, which, you know, they're paid to go out and like write comments on pages of people who are writing about the protests, or journalists. So all of these people are getting threats. They're getting all of these like challenging comments or questions or insults. And, you know, by now, with all of these waves of protest that we've seen in the previous years, we are used to it and we know what to expect. And I think that's why the current protests are extremely powerful. We know how the manipulation of protests occur. We know exactly how Vucic's hooligans look like. We know who they are. We know how to recognize them in the crowd as they try to create something that will stir the people away from the protest. Vucic has also been like throwing in random mini protests to talk about the situation in Kosovo or just like random stuff in order to manipulate. But everybody already knows these tactics and people kind of see through this bullshit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you're in a particularly good place, I think, to really give us an idea of what people there are saying. You know, you're from Serbia, you're there now, you've traveled, you know, around the world, whatever, and they're not part of this kind of weird government, political, violent elite. So what is it you're seeing from like your people? What are they saying about these protests? Do they think like, yeah, this is going to work this time, or what? Because, you know, we saw the clashes a few years ago. It looked very, you know, it looked like, wow, okay, something's actually going to happen. And then it just fizzled out. What about this time? What are people thinking?
I would say that this time there is kind of a bigger wave carrying everybody. So maybe personally, I can add that my own parents, my own father, who has been very active in the revolution during Milosevic, all of this generation who witnessed the wars and who went out in the streets to fight against it, now they actually started saying all of these events remind us of the stuff that was happening during the breakup of Yugoslavia. And they say this is the first time since then that we really felt like the momentum is being gained. People have nothing more to lose. I think that's the key point. People literally have nothing more to lose. And the only way to go is to move forward. So there's a lot of excitement, not only in young people and my generation, but also the older generations. You have like grandmas coming into the protest. You have older people from rural areas writing these signs, like that literally you read them and you want to cry, asking for like the most basic elements of life and like to stop being insulted by a regime like this. So there's definitely a consensus that these protests have resemblance to something from the year 2000 when Slobodan Milosevic was finally sort of evicted. But of course, the problem still hasn't been solved. And everybody knows this, and everybody is miserable. I really don't know any single person other than, the ones belonging to this elite living parallel lives who's truly happy in this society. It just kind of gradually degraded. So truly, people have nothing more to lose. And it's going forward. Absolutely.
That's interesting that there's all these different demographics and stuff, but let's be honest, there is no ever going to be a revolution in Serbia without violence. It's just not going to happen. Not saying there should be violence, but it's just there's no way that these protests surely are actually going to help to topple the government. Or is it that these people are thinking of building a movement for the next 3 years until elections? Or what is it? Like, what do they think will happen? Or is it not that? Is it just like an expression of the disgust? I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that this movement is kind of gaining momentum because multiple oppositionary parties are building on it. And you can really see that right now the strategies of the government are pretty much mapped out. Like everybody knows, like, the kind of ace from the sleeve that Vucic and his people can throw. So I think that even the people who were pro-Vucic so far and who kind of thought that he was bringing employment and bridges and foreign investors. After this incident of dead children and Vucic not taking responsibility, they're not going to vote for him again. So this momentum needs to keep going. And I'm not sure if it would be somehow possible to rearrange the election times or to involve foreign agencies. But I do know that this is not stopping anytime soon.
When you say foreign agencies, you're gonna be accused of being a Western CIA puppet immediately.
I know.
I know what you mean, though, right? You don't mean like CIA regime change.
No. I don't mean that. I just mean like, preferably some kind of aid from the EU. Although this is difficult to expect, I have to say. And we as Serbs share the collective sentiment that we kind of don't receive help from any side other than the sides who are trying to use us. And Vucic has very much played on multiple chairs. He's been, he switched from being an absolute heavy nationalist far-right politician in the 90s. He literally said the sentence on TV, "For each Serbian, we will kill hundreds of Muslims."
Fucking hell.
And then he kind of pretended to change his politics in recent years. And like he, is pretending to be playing on this EU path and, rubbing shoulders with Macron and all of these officials in Europe. But meanwhile, internally, he's running the exact same systems that were in place since the war. So at the same time, he's not sanctioning Russia. He's inviting all of these foreign investors, particularly from China, which is something that has been very, very, very concerning because of the ecological and democratic decay that's happening. So, yeah, I really think that Vucic has been playing this game for way too long. People see it, it's evident, and it can only move forward. I don't know what is the best solution to move forward, but I think there's plenty of people who are very actively thinking about this. And I don't believe Vucic will be elected again. My opinion, at least.
Can you explain that China thing you mentioned briefly there? Because I remember we were talking, there's a very specific situation, right, where China essentially has kind of de facto power in a small town and is, like just kind of set up shop. What's that?
Yeah, well, this is a particularly sinister case. So essentially, a couple of years ago, China, or like the CCP, came to my hometown. and build a tire factory called Linglong. And this tire factory was built like slightly on the outskirts, but every time I would come back home, it would just grow magically. And right now it's huge. There's just blocks and blocks and blocks of buildings. And it became evident that they have actually been bringing Vietnamese slave workers to work in this factory. And they were working in absolutely dehumanizing conditions. These people were taken their passports, they rationed their foods. They were living, I mean, we can also see this every time we drive by, but they're living in these extremely minimal conditions, and essentially they're being used as slave workers. So the problem erupted when the locals here noticed that this stuff was happening and that this is serious human rights violation. But every time they would try to enter the property, either like journalists or whoever wanted to see what the hell was going on in there were these guards. They were protecting it, and they basically say that it's impossible to go into this property because it's the property of the CCP on our soil. So this is just one of many examples of instances that are extremely problematic. They're being imported from China. For example, our government a couple of years ago implemented the Huawei facial recognition system, installing a bunch of facial recognition cameras all over Belgrade, also bringing Chinese cops to Belgrade. And our government used this system in order to see who went to demo, like who attended and came out in the streets, and then later would use this information to basically like invite people to go to court or punish them. So this is extremely messed up because our government is using all the worst tools of control and authoritarian control in particular in order to manipulate its own people, on top of already bringing slave workers and also inviting lithium mining that happens also in Serbia. So this is just really the tip of the iceberg. I can talk for hours about all the instances, but the one about China is particularly worrisome because I noticed this trend and I lived in China. And when I lived there, like all I could think about is I'm just so happy that this stuff, this level of control, this level of ecological decay, air pollution is not happening back home. And then it happens, all of it. Air pollution, everything.
Yeah, and the air pollution is like some of the worst in Europe, right? In Serbia, from what I remember.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's been deteriorating seriously over the last couple of years. And over the last years, we actually topped some of the world's, forerunners in air pollution in India and China. And there's also a really active ecological movement who has been organizing protests as well, but with very, very little luck because our official really, they just don't seem to care about the environment. They only care about the profit, even if it's at the price of the lives of hundreds of thousands of Serbs who suffer health consequences.
Yeah, it's a very European story, unfortunately. So we spoke a little bit about the situation in Kosovo. Obviously, whenever a government in either Albania or Kosovo, or Serbia needs some kind of national leverage, Kosovo comes into play. It's been going on for decades now. Recently, though, there have been real serious clashes in Kosovo, like to the point where it's not just like, a flare-up, like actual NATO KFOR forces went in and got, I think, over 30 of them were like quite badly injured. So serious stuff is happening. Maybe just explain to us what's going on in Kosovo on the Serbian side right now.
Right. Well, at least from what I've seen and read, what happened is that essentially the northern Kosovo region is mostly populated by Serbs. And this has been one of the problematic regions because people still live there and they reject the Kosovo authorities. So local elections came around for like the governors of multiple regions in northern Kosovo. But the Serbs there got instructions from Belgrade, from Vucic clearly, to not go out and vote. So this voting was essentially boycotted by Serbs. So then the 3% of Albanians who actually lived there came out and, surprise, they chose Albanian officials. So what happened then is that the Kosovo forces, like KFOR, actually marched in and essentially came in and took the offices while the Serbs were protesting, and this is where the clashes began. But the really interesting and kind of peculiar thing is that if you look at the images of these conflicts, there's all of these extremely buff Serbian men that like don't really look like the average citizen, I do have to say. So many of men wearing like black hats, and to us back home, this is weirdly resonating with these inserted elements, as we like to call them, of like Vucic's hooligans who are kind of added to do the dirty work for them.
I remember when the clashes were happening, he had the equivalent to like what was the Ukrainian Tutushki back in when the revolution happened in Ukraine, where Yanukovych was just getting like literal hooligans and just paying them to be like basically enforcers to fuck shit up. Do you really think that's happening there?
Well, I mean, I think the chances are pretty high because it's a very, very strange coincidence that this stuff is happening right now. And Vucic is traveling all over Europe and like advocating for, like a solution to the problem and protection of the people. And like, what about the stuff happening in Serbia right now? It's kind of like derailing the conversation from the most important thing is that we don't want you in power anymore. You're manipulating everybody into the system. I mean, I'm sure that like Albin Kurti has similar like techniques in order to manipulate that. Like they're literally using this region as a proxy to do their dirty work. So that's kind of how at least I and my generation perceive it. And this is not to undermine the suffering of the actual Serbian minority north of Kosovo, which I very much empathize with, because this must be freaking awful living in a region like this where you're receiving instructions from your own government because you trust them, because that's the only thing you can turn to. But in turn, what's happening is that this government is pulling strings and using them strategically as a pawn, literally as a sacrifice in order to play out their wars. And this is one of the major holds of Vucic. He always refers back to Kosovo. And this is something that has been a very powerful hold on the majority of the Serbian population.
How are you going to complain that Albanian mayors got in when you boycotted the election?
Well, yeah, exactly. And also that was instructed, the boycott. So
the government actually came out, did they? And they said, yeah, don't vote.
Yeah, that was the instruction.
Really?
Yes, it's immature. It's absolutely immature. And this is the case with many things that happen here. Like you are unable to follow information because everything seems to be a kind of web of lies where you're not really sure who to listen to anymore. And it's really difficult to keep a cool head with all of this.
Where does Russia come into play in all this? We know that Serbia is very much, at least the government is very much acts like very pro-Russia sometimes, but then, like you said, he kind of has one foot in each camp, or at least tries to play both sides. How much influence does Russia actually have there now?
I would say a lot of influence, because historically, I've always remembered that Serbs basically perceive Russia and Russians as like brothers. So that's kind of like the drawing on this Slavic brotherhood as a very powerful bond. And also considering the fact that in 1999, Serbia was bombed by NATO, which is still very much very alive and painful memory for a lot of us, and just kind of like revealed major hypocrisies of the West and particularly of NATO. People are hesitant to trust the West.
And maybe just explain why that is, because immediately people jump to, well, Serbs were committing, trying to commit genocide, which is true. Like, let's not pretend. Yeah. But at the same time, hundreds, I think over 400 civilians were also killed in those NATO bombings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, this bombing happened in a time where our government was committing atrocities. These atrocities were not supported, or they were heavily condemned by the local population. Similarly as now, people did not have a choice. People living in cities in Serbia were locked in this system. They have been protesting this very regime doing those things in all the neighboring regions. But then when NATO actually bombed and did not consult the Security Council on this and just kind of went ahead, they bombed at the heart. They bombed Belgrade, they bombed Novi Sad, they killed several thousand civilians. They also directly aimed at the main building of like journalists, and they killed several journalists in Serbia who at the time were literally opposing and reporting against the government. So you can imagine that the people who were protesting the system locked in then also get bombed on top of that by NATO. Like what can you do? Your mistrust is of course going to grow, because what else is there to do? You have nobody to rely on except yourselves. So that's kind of like the sentiment behind why this was such a sinister event and very much a living memory. Also, the depleted uranium that's been thrown in the soil today still has really, really intense effects on the cancer rates in Serbia. I can say that many of my friends have cancer, my own family, and just like stuff that never happened before. There's also real data on this that's been collected. There's a clear correlation between the NATO bombing, depleted uranium in the soil, and increase in cancer rates. So this is a very particularly painful spot for a lot of people. And you can imagine that then you have to turn elsewhere for support. And, unfortunately, Russia has a lot of control over this. But I also cannot say that I don't understand it. I understand it to some extent.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, it sucks, but like, yeah, it's tricky because trying to have like normal conversations about this, it's very weird. Like I was talking a while ago online and was saying, well, yeah, it's like if you even mention to some people like, well, yeah, okay, like Serbia doing insane fucking ethnic cleansing was absolutely awful. But then if you go, you then say, well, it's also kind of sucks that like, NATO then just bombed civilians. People are like, no, like don't mention, like they literally want you to not mention it. I've been accused of being pro-Russian because I'm like, hey, should we probably not just like call all Serbs rats as soon as something happens in Kosovo? And people are like, oh, Vatnik. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, it's crazy. Like, that's. And I know that's like, fucking losers online, but it is definitely, it's still, I think even in, real world, it's pervasive like that. People are so, and I understand why, like people are so fucking angry about this shit, but I don't know, how do you feel like as a Serb who is not in favor of like ethnic cleansing, but also recognizes bad things have happened to your people? Like, how do you feel when people are going like, yeah, let's bomb them again, like when something happens in Kosovo?
I mean, how can I feel? I feel fucking terrible. Like, of course. Also, like during the NATO bombing, there was this really famous cover from the Time magazine that was like bringing the Serbs to heel, bombing for peace, and all of this stuff. Biden, like Clinton, all these people were coming out on TV and just saying like, we need to just flat out the Serbs together with the ground. We need to destroy this. It's just been so much anti-Serb rhetoric, which I, of course, understand, but for the people who don't support the ethnic cleansing and also similarly don't support, what we're going through, how the hell are you supposed to continue living where you know that you have nobody to turn to? And, people find defense mechanisms. I surely have my own defense mechanisms, but I feel a deep sense of injustice about the sentiment. And I try to talk to people. I try to listen to people, because I think that when somebody comes at me with a comment like this, or some kind of ignorant thing, or like making sly comments that we deserve the NATO bombing, then I tend to bring up the depleted uranium in the soil, that like my own brother had cancer because of this stuff. And then when they actually see that there were real human beings trapped in the system that suffer the consequences that the government was not punished for, or like only a handful of officials were sent to The Hague, I would say many of these people are still roaming the streets and oppressing the very people who live here. So, of course, I feel a deep sense of injustice about this. And I feel like nobody wants to listen to this perspective. I'm surprised that recently there was this big New York Times article writing about Vucic and his, relationship to the criminal underground in Serbia. So things are kind of beginning. And I think people are starting to listen to this perspective, which feels a bit hopeful. But for a very long time, nobody would entertain this, and everything reported around Serbs would be negative. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's I know a few Serbs, I know a few Albanians, get on fine with both of them, no problem. And certainly when they might even have a bit of a obviously they're talking politics, they get very heated, but if you talk to them normal, they're kind of like, yeah, nah, we don't actually want to go back to that shit. It's people are in this kind of headspace where they think that, I don't know, it just seems to be a caricature of a nation, and I really think that's just so fucking unhealthy, just from any side.
It's dehumanizing, it's insulting, and I think I got an interesting perspective of this because I moved away when I was 18 and I studied abroad, and only after a couple of years of kind of gathering observations and having this meta perspective on my own culture, I can kind of see some interesting things happening, which is that, as Slavoj Žižek puts it, the Balkans are considered to be like the subconscious of Europe. And it's always thrown in there. It's the stuff you don't want to confront, but you cannot really look away, because a lot of people, and I noticed this, are very thirsty for this kind of energy because they're simply not allowed to express many things that we naturally express on a daily basis. And I think this is pretty much universal for the Balkans. But also, it's just so insane that people have these stereotypes that we're all stupid, warmongering people. And, it's really important to then amplify the perspectives that kind of speak against it. But at the same time, we kind of don't want to fully speak against it. You can see that there's a lot of intellectuals, really smart people. There's a lot of different stuff happening. But also, we kind of use the creation of these myths and stereotype as a new aesthetic, as kind of a meta ironic layer that we like to play upon, because okay, if you're going to demonize us, then we might as well use this and go full in if you want to. It's kind of like a game that we play with foreigners, I would say.
Like the Gopnik joke, essentially embracing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, also now it's becoming a TikTok trend, which is a whole other level of cringe, of course.
Everything becomes bimboification in the end. You know what I'm saying? I think your point is relevant, especially since we've seen the kind of the way that the Ukraine war has just become a way for kind of desk-based ultra violence enjoyers to filter out their own hidden insecurities onto Twitter by literally praising the bombing of young men who are praying not to die in trenches and thinking that that's really cool because it's the other side. I think it all plays into that, and unfortunately I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think the NAFOification of war is not going away, and I think it's extremely unhealthy, but that's why we keep doing Popular Front. Fuck all that shit. In terms of the kind of mafia relations that the Serbian government has, you kind of just mentioned it very briefly there. I think that's worth talking about because that's a big deal, right, in terms of the perception of the people. Maybe tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a really, really important point, and it's been surfacing out recently because a lot of journalists have been heavily working on exposing the connections that Vucic and his government have with the criminal underground. And obviously the most important case here was with Veljko Belivuk, who I already mentioned. So this person was a gang leader who used to be a soccer hooligan, cocaine trafficker, kidnapper, arms dealer, you name it. And essentially, Vucic came out in 2021. He came on TV, as I said, and he reported the arrest of this person. He showed all of these gruesome images of headless bodies. And not only this, but he also revealed that this gang actually lured its victims to a so-called house of horrors in a Belgrade suburb where people were tortured, dismembered, and fed through an industrial meat grinder that they used to make human kebabs, literally. So, this person was making human kebabs and dumping body parts into the Danube for the fish to eat. But at the same time, the Vucic kind of came out as the hero of the story. And I cannot even make this shit up. He came on TV and he gave a speech I will not allow human kebabs to be made in this country. I'm going to fight the making of human kebabs. I would rather have myself killed than allow this person to make human kebabs. And it's like, God, we're watching all of this shit on TV. Like, okay, you already like messed up with our head, but this is intense. But what happened then, I think nobody expected this, is that when the police actually arrested Belivuk, he started talking about Vucic, and he revealed information that he was being instructed by Vucic to do his dirty work. So, this is a very, very interesting connection. And it seems like from multiple sources that Vucic was a kind of like uber boss of Belivuk. And this is not surprising because Vucic, first of all, has a history being involved with the Red Star, like criminal adjacent hooligan club. But like, interestingly, I read this report from this journalist recently who was like a strong Vucic opponent. Apparently, he wasn't deemed worthy enough to be like the leader and to be like heavily involved. He just kind of simped for this Red Star football club, which is pretty insane. But the interesting thing that came out of this Belivuk case is that it seems like Belivuk was like the president's like dark twin, like somebody who embodied this criminal underworld of a state which is growing towards the autocratic direction very, very heavily. So, people now generally have the consensus, and it's been proven on multiple occasions, that Vucic allowed these gangsters to become a virtual arm of the state. Like, he is literally creating an environment where he blurs the line between organized crime and, the state uses this to their advantage. Like, if you go to any kind of football match in Belgrade, particularly like Red Star versus Partizan, these stadiums are kind of like the crucible of ethnic nationalism, which destroyed Yugoslavia, and people who go there are able to release all of these tensions and fight and use this as a kind of proxy war. So the football hooligan scene and the criminals are very, very much intertwined with the state, and this existed ever since the Yugoslav wars and persists today.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just typical Serbs. It seems like this is not going to get any better. Where do you see this heading? I know it's impossible to, predict, but what's your feeling?
I mean, I find it very difficult to imagine all of these hooligans just magically disappearing because, it's not like groups that are identifiable. I mean, some of them are, but it's also a lot of the behaviors are kind of reinforced in this society. And a lot of people exhibit some elements of this. It's become our culture to an extent. And this is very, very difficult. Like, I cannot see this going away anytime soon. I can see potentially and maybe hope for Vucic to lose power sometime in the near future, but then kind of erasing and like reducing the effects that were done by not only the war, but the aftermath of the war and this regime is going to be a multiple decade long project. You have to kind of deprogram people to behave this way. And this, I think, will be a bit difficult, but I do think there's a strong consensus of people who want to go against this behavior.
All right. Well, I hope it works out. Where can people follow your work if they want to, get in touch with you and see what you do?
They can follow my Instagram if they want. It's ambient content. So yeah, feel free to follow me there. It's kind of like a mixture of everything that I'm doing right now. So I don't really have any particular work to promote. I'm technically like an ostracized scientist, dabbling a bit in different projects. But yeah, feel free to find me there.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Jovana.
Thank you, Jake.
That was scientist and researcher Jovana Maksic. She is very, very good on all of this, very nuanced. I think she is definitely worth listening to regarding the political situation in Serbia. Check her out on Instagram, as she said, ambient content. If you like what we're doing and you want to support us, you want to see this keep growing, go to patreon.com/popularfront. There's loads of extras there for very little money every single month. It keeps us moving forward. It means we don't have to rely or go to any corporate-backed investors or anything weird like that. Currently, we're keeping everything grassroots, and that's how we want to keep it. So yeah, patreon.com/popularfront. Check out the shop. We got all new merch there and an anthology of the zines. So if you missed out on the zines, you can go there and get all of them together in a brand new book type thing. That's www.popularfront.shop. Follow us on social media, Instagram @popular.front. We are completely shadow banned on there, despite having almost 500,000 followers. So if you can, follow us there @popular.front. Twitter @popularfront_. The TikTok is @popular.front. Yeah, that's everything. YouTube, our new documentary reporting from the ground in France amidst the riots, showing how it's not just about pension reforms. youtube.com/popularfront. Oh yeah, thank you to our sponsors, Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. You can see them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue 97239. If you go in and tell them Popular Front send you, you will get a discount of some kind. Also, Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. Also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. You can find them on socials at Grindcore House. Very soon we're going to be launching a coffee, literally Popular Front coffee beans with them, very specific, very strong. It's going to be called Flight Risk coffee. We're going to be launching that with Grindcore House literally within a month. So yeah, that will be going there. Check them out, they're cool, very good people, very nice people to work with. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Check his music out at samblackpf.com. There are links to his SoundCloud and Spotify, all of that. Definitely look him up. Very big part of Popular Front. His Instagram is samblack.jpeg, JPEG. Thank you to the high tier patrons. They are Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Victor Villa, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Claire Hoffbauer, Benjamin Tupper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Cameron Collins, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Zwick, Kafir, Petter Nybraten, Gabriel K, Elise Middlefart, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Amsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, K Glitter Vulcan, Adam H, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Jack Doherty, Nicholas Butter, JD, Jav, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, D San, Mike Barone, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, the Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Niebuhr, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Dan Dunham, Chad Walker, Lawrence Abrahams, Pete McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zubul. Thank you all very much. It's very much appreciated. With the cost of living crisis, a lot of people have messaged me like, look, I can't support on Patreon anymore. Totally understand that. Unfortunately, it means we've taken a very big hit. So I do very much appreciate all the people still out there able to and continuing to support us on the Patreon. A lot of new content is coming, as I'm sure you will see.